Hello. It's it's a real honour to be here, although I've used these words, it's an honour to be here to begin a few lectures in my time and in my life. Now more than any other time I can think of, I really do mean them. It's a real honour to be here, and it's quite humbling as well. There are scientists here in the audience, and they always make a writer like myself feel quite like the poor country relative at a posh wedding, because if I think something is true, it's usually based on anecdotes, but scientists have the data sets and the peer-reviewed papers, and I'm a little bit in awe of you, so please give me an easy ride anyway. Well, I've called my shortish lecture 13 Ways of Looking at a Stammer. And many of you will recognise the allusion in this title to the poem by the great modernist American poet Wallace Stevens, whose most famous poem is called 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. It would be perfect at this point if I could state that Stevens was a stammerer, like the British poet Philip Larkin, or that his famous Blackbird poem was about stammering, but unfortunately neither statement would be actually true. Nonetheless, the poem is about the multifacetedness of phenomena, how one thing is many things. And it reminds me how the human mind shares the urge that most media organs also show to first simplify and then exaggerate. This happens about stammering as well as other things. So I wasn't going to read the poem because it would be really indulgent. It's not that long, but and this morning I was woken up by a really loud blackbird outside my window, so I took this as a sign from God or from nature to actually include the poem. So I hope you'll allow me to read it. It's short and lucid and beautiful, and maybe you'll think of it as a sort of a gin and tonic served with a drop or two of bergamot before the pasta is served. And there's quite a lot of pasta, so enjoy the gin and tonic. 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by Wallace Stevens. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of a blackbird. That's the first way of looking at a blackbird. It's quite short. 2. I was of 3 minds, like a tree, in which there are 3 blackbirds. 3. The blackbird whirled in the autumn winds. It was a small part of the pantomime. 4. A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. If anyone works out what that means, please tell me, because I don't have a clue what that means. 5. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. That's relevant to speech. 6. Icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow, an indecipherable cause. 7. O thin men of Haddam, why do you imagine golden birds? Do you not see how the blackbird walks around the feet of the women about you? 8. I know noble accents and lucid, inescapable rhythms, but I know too that the blackbird is involved in what I know. 9. When the blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. 10. At the sight of blackbirds flying in a green light, even the boards of euphony would cry out sharply. 11. He rode over Connecticut in a glass coach. Once a fear pierced him in that he mistook the shadow of his equipage for blackbirds. 12. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. 13. It was evening, all afternoon, and it was snowing, and it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs. Isn't it a beaut? My 13-year-old Stottering self would never have believed that aged 44 I'd be here in the Netherlands quoting poetry to an audience of a couple of hundred, believe me. Actually, I would phone him to tell him if I had his number, but it's not on my iPhone, unfortunately, so he's just going to have to sweat it out the hard way like I do. But for my lecture, I thought I'd follow Wallace Stevens' example by identifying and discussing 13 ways of looking at a stammer. At first I was a little bit afraid that I couldn't reach 13, but I found once I got going...
These are now also...
Hey. I'm enjoying this. If anyone at the back can hear me, then thumbs up. Yeah, thank you.
Is this microphone?
Thank you. So at first I was afraid that I could reach 13 ways of looking at the stammer, but actually I found once I got going they did start to flow. I've sequenced them in a sort of dark to light order, so if the first few feel a little nihilistic, then don't despair, the cavalry is on the way. 1. A stammer can be looked upon as a kind of a curse. Now, a curse, according to the dictionary, causes harm and misery for its victims, and for us people as stammers, it can sure as hell feel that harm and misery are precisely what our stammers cause. I think many of us have a sort of first contact anecdote with our stammers, an anecdote in which we, or memory, in which we first became aware that something was wrong with our speech, and we couldn't speak as effortlessly as the other kids were speaking in our class. In fact, we couldn't speak at all in some cases. Shared or secret, these first contact memories burn in our memories with all the bright, hot shame that kids are prone to feel when we recognise that we're guilty of the first-degree crime of not fitting in. My first contact memory, my own first contact memory for what it's worth, is linked with a game of hangman. I don't know if this game is truly international or whether it's just in the Anglophone world. Do you play hangman in the Netherlands? Yeah? It's for people from even further afield with different alphabets. It's a kind of a word game. It's rather a brutal word game where you guess a whole word that the other person has imagined by guessing its component letters one by one. And for each wrong guess, you draw one line of a little picture of a gallows and a hanged man. Until either you guess the word correctly or the poor man is hanged. Actually, my wife hates this game. She finds it rather brutal, so she's invented a very sweet alternative called coffee cup, where you draw the lines of a cup of coffee. And so I always think of her when I think of hangman. Anyway, one day, I must have been 7 or 8, so quite a lot older than the age group that the first speaker that we had the pleasure to listen this morning was talking about, the preschool age. But I was about 6 or 7 or 8. We were playing hangman at school, and I knew what the answer was. The answer was the name Napoleon, which is a strange word for a teacher to choose, I admit, but she was quite a strange teacher. I put my hand up to answer and experienced my very first self-recorded stammer. I know I don't need to explain or describe to you how that feels. Everyone here knows how that feels. I felt literally cursed, like some witch had placed a spell on my tongue and on my mouth that was stopping me saying the word. It happened some days later, again and again, and then became a factor of my life, really. And I remember dreading my 9th birthday because at the time it was N words, Napoleon, November, many words beginning with an N. And so I dreaded my 9th birthday because then I knew when someone asked me how old I was going to be, or how old I was going to have to lie. And I remember thinking that I'd never be able to get a job unless it was a lighthouse keeper. And what have I done to deserve this curse? 2. A stammer is an inhibitor. It's a preventer, it can be, an opportunity reducer, a life shrinker. It can stop you doing things. And over the years, my own stammer has led me to avoid answering the phone, even though I knew a potential employer was calling. I wish I'd been to Harry's workshop that I just went to this morning, but I was only 11 years old and couldn't have flown to the Netherlands on my own then, so hey. Another time I slammed down the phone when I finally summoned up the courage to phone a girl I liked because I couldn't say my own name. I've asked for tea when what I really wanted to drink was coffee. I couldn't say C and still have a hard time with the hard C's. And for years I would say, what are you up to today, instead of what are you doing today? Another time I begged the sympathetic headmaster of my school to be excused the sixth form prefect's duty of reading an assembly in front of the whole school, like I'm doing now. Anyway, the list would go on, and I know you all know how it feels. I felt trapped inside a maze designed by a sadist with no exit. Of course, the maze had no exit, not the sadist. In the same way, my stammer prevented me from saying certain consonants in a sentence. It seemed that my stammer would also block off a range of life experiences, major experiences and minor experiences. I remember my well-meaning mother trying to get me to consider a rather directionless son, trying to get me to think about my future career and saying, well, teaching's out, isn't it, because of your stammer. This was one of the very few occasions that either of my parents referred to my disfluency, even indirectly. And it wasn't a subject that I ever brought up, either really. There's a great phrase in English, the elephant in the living room. Did you say that in Dutch? The elephant in the living room? Yep. You do. It means, of course, the really obvious, huge subject. It's as big as an elephant, and it's there in the living room, but you never talk about it. And yeah, my dear mum was trying to be helpful, of course, but I've rarely felt as mortified or as miserable. It wasn't that I harboured a burning desire to be a teacher. It was just a casual way that a single remark could slam shut this big iron door on a whole vocation, not a vacation, a vocation. And in the end, I taught English for 10 years, happily and pretty much fluently, but that's a story for a later blackbird. 3. A stammer can be a source of self-loathing. Like many teenagers, I constantly fretted that I was failing to be the suave, witty, popular individual that the world seems to tell you you need to be to survive and prosper. And as a person with a stammer, as a kid with a stammer, I carried an extra 50 kilograms worth of guilt that I couldn't even get a sentence out without looking like I was having some sort of fit. Unknowingly, I think I had brought into the myth, I believed the myth, that stammering is caused by a lack of willpower. And so when a classmate or a teacher wasn't sort of yelling, "Spit it out, Mitchell," or "For God's sake, just say it," I was actually yelling it at myself for not trying hard enough. I was duped, I was fooled by the all-persuasive force of popular wisdom that says it's about willpower. And I didn't stop to consider that actually a person with a stammer has to be a blast furnace of willpower. We have highly developed muscles of willpower, and we need these just to dial a number into a phone, or well, that ages me, doesn't it? To press the number into the phone, or to walk up to a ticket counter, or to risk answering a question in class instead of just mumbling, "I don't know, sir." Popular wisdom is wrong. Stammering is not caused by a lack of willpower, and this view that I still think is widely held in the world is lazy and it is pernicious just as much as it is false. Willpower is a marvellous thing, and it helps you climb mountains you never thought you could climb, But without experience, equipment and training, mountaineers can sometimes end up falling down a glacier and getting a broken spine and dying of exposure. And on that gloomy note, 4. A stammer can be a humiliator. It's going to get better soon, so just stay with me. Why is it so humiliating when we stammer? Might it be because it infantilises us? You know, look, we're all grown up, but we can't even get a sentence out. Or could it be because of how we look when we lock on a word, with eyes popping, we go red and sweat, and our breathing's all over the place as if we're fighting a losing battle against demonic possession? It's the opposite of dignified, anyway, or what the popular views of dignity are. Or do we experience humiliation for the same reason that we feel self-loathing? Because we're buying into an essentially false narrative, which states that stammering is some kind of optional, humiliating hobby, that if only we had enough willpower to get over, we could. If there is truth in that, then why would society evolve this heartless narrative? You know, we know the world can be a heartless place. You switch on the news and there's ample evidence of that. And maybe mockery is a weak person's way of bolstering that person's own ego at the expense of another. Maybe Freudian ideas about laughter being a reflex action to something unknown and frightening may also be useful. If the person you're speaking with doesn't know you have a stammer and you hit a bad block, then maybe a nervous flutter is a sort of understandable response, even if it is unwelcome. In the playground or in the workplace, tormentors may humiliate us simply because it is in their nature to do so. And sometimes kinder people can unintentionally humiliate us because they don't know we don't want them to finish our sentences for us. Stammering can be humiliating because to refuse to be humiliated can cost us levels of energy and self-respect that we can't always maintain. But the good news that I would like to tell my 13-year-old self, again, if his number was on my iPhone, is that self-respect is a muscle that I think can be trained as well as strained. Self-respect is not a faculty you're either born with or born without. And I've found that as you age, it becomes harder for others to humiliate you without your consent. 5. A stammer can be a guilty secret. So I wasn't really the kind of the one official gold medalist stammerer at school. And this was because my concealment mechanisms, they were often just about good enough to let me kind of pass as not abnormally disfluent. In some ways, this partial camouflage was a blessing, of course. I was probably humiliated less frequently and less severely. But in other ways, my in-the-closet status as a stammerer actually contributed to the curse. Apart from obscuring my need for speech therapy, which I needed and could have benefited from, my hidden stammer also sustains the fear that I would be outed and humiliated and then usurp the official stammerer from his throne of shame. Think of that Shakespeare quote, I think he gives it to Julius Caesar, that a brave man dies only once, but a coward dies 1,000 times, something like that. 1,000 times I died, that's probably an understatement. But I used to have this recurring nightmare that the zombie apocalypse had actually taken place and I was the last human being on Earth. And I was just about surviving by acting like a zombie and dressing like a zombie and grunting like a zombie. But the moment I knew, the moment I made a slip and my zombie disguise wasn't quite perfect, and I did or said something that marked me out as a fresh meat human being, then the real zombies would stop whatever they were doing and kind of look at me with this zombie expression. And then I knew that I had to wake up before they ripped my flesh apart. Now, being a relatively high-functioning stammerer, to take a quote from the World of Autism, It was a little bit like that nightmare, but of course there's no waking from it. So I would dread my enemies guessing at my guilty secret, because then, of course, as a kid you have no defences against them. When my friends guessed, then they usually didn't mention it. But that non-mention was as tangible as a mention, because I knew, of course, that they knew, and I knew that they pitied me for it. So if, as Oscar Wilde said, homosexuality is the love that dare not say its name, and perhaps stammering is the disability that cannot say its name. I think we're up to 6. It gets a bit nicer now. Stammering is a mystery. Is stammering genetic? How could it not be? It's hardly bacterial or viral, is it? Are there too many of us from protected family backgrounds for it? And there are too many of us from protected family backgrounds for it to be the result of trauma or abuse. And too many of us from abusive backgrounds for my grammar's all over the place. Sorry, I was writing part of this on the plane. Ryanair. It's handy actually. I can blame my lapses on Ryanair. Completely unfair, but. And there are too many of us from abusive backgrounds for stammering to have arisen from overprotection, I think. If stammering is a simple question of faulty neural connections, and I'm looking forward to a workshop later today that could enlighten me here. If stammering is a simple question of faulty neural connections, then how come so many of us are fluent for a while during infancy, but then lose that fluency later on? Yet then again, how can stammering not be a neurological phenomenon if it's not merely muscular? If it is neural, can we rewire those defective synapses? This is where I wish I was a scientist, because I wouldn't have to guess or Google up my vocabulary. But if it is neural, can we rewire these defective neural connections like some stroke survivors can? Is this what happens when a stammerer overcomes his stammer and can suddenly communicate as rapidly as an Irish bookkeeper on race day? Apologies to Michael if he's here. But I've lived in Clonakilty for 10 years, so maybe I have the right. Is there a connection between disorders on the autistic spectrum and stammering? Could they be distant relatives? If stammering is genetic, what factors cause the stammering gene to be switched on? What is going on when non-stammering parents have a stammering kid? Why are stammers so fickle? Why can they come and go so inconsistently? Why is it they're so good at hiding from speech therapists? If stammering is stress-related, how can a stammerer like Charles I of England purportedly be given a free pass at a trial held to determine whether or not he'll be executed, as history records he was? Why do the consonants on which we block shift over time? Why does the rest of the word apparently influence whether or not I'll stammer on the start of the word? So, how can I have trouble with the American river's name Shenandoah, but I'm able to say the name of the author of 1001 Nights, Scheherazade, or the Polish town Szczecin, without any trouble? How can I say the word captain, but not camel, which is the name of my editor, which gets problematic? How can I say sit, but not city? I'm so glad I'm standing on cue here. I was afraid that I would come out really fluent here. Oh, this guy is just a fake. He shouldn't be here. It would be like the zombie apocalypse dream, and I'd be running all the way to Lunteren station with a horde of angry people after me saying, "Get him! He's not one of us!" Why do certain stammering treatments and programs work on one stammerer but not on another? And even when they work, do they work forever really? Or is a relapse inevitable? Adding to the woes of a stressed out stammerer the knowledge that he's also a starfish program loser. I've heard good things about the program, so I'm not looking at. How can the knowledge that you're speaking to another stammerer, how can that affect the severity of your own disfluency? Can the severity of a stammer be measured objectively, like the Richter scale objectively measures earthquakes, or even phenomenologically, like the Beaufort scale for wind strength? Thanks to our keynote speaker this morning, I've learned that there is such a thing as the Yale scale that gives a subjective measurement. One of many things I've already learned today. And it's only at 2 o'clock, it's turning into a good day. Of course, also as this poor country cousin at the posh scientific wedding, I'm aware that I'm able to ask these questions without positing any answers. So if novelists ever look impressive to you, don't believe it. We're just re-askers of questioners. We don't really have the answer hat. 7. Stammering is a political issue. I could happily spend my whole hour on this aspect of stammering alone, but I'll confine myself to a couple of political issues connected with stammering. First is the question, should a welfare state provide access to speech therapy to help citizens with speech disfluences? I was very interested to just have a brief chat with one of the Japanese attendees at the conference this morning over breakfast, who tells me that people who are very hard of hearing in Japan do get a disability pass that gives them various benefits in daily life in Japan. The same pass is not extended to people with speech disfluences, but they're both intrinsically linked with communication. So how come? The answer, of course, lies in the political arena. I would say yes, a welfare state should provide access to speech therapy if that state wishes to call itself civilised. But of course, in times of austerity, speech therapy is probably a softer target even than libraries. If a local health authority shut down its audiology units and declared, "I'm sorry old people, but there's no more money for your hearing aids," then the barricades would be manned and blood would flow. But if speech and language therapy services get cut and cut and cut, and what are local people with stammers going to do? No one's expecting us to march on Parliament with megaphones. We aren't in a political bloc, and we're relatively few in numbers, which we're not. There's millions of us, but to become politically active, first you have to out yourself as a person with a stammer. So there's this block, in a way, which people who are hard of hearing, I think, maybe that obstacle isn't quite so off-putting or extreme or optional. Because of the negative stereotypes about stammers, of course. I'm also a patron of the British Stammering Association, and I was informed that last year in Nottingham, large British city, I can't give you the population, but I'm confident it's in the top 10 in terms of population, it cut its speech and language services to 0. So really, it's right, if you live in Nottingham and your kid has a stammer or you have a stammer, then the quantity of help that you can avail yourself of is 0, big fat 0. Perhaps to people from a less welfare-orientated society, such as the United States, this might sound like quite a cute thing to complain about, but at least from where I'm from, this is an appalling dereliction of responsibility by local government. They're really from national government that doesn't make the resources available. I would argue that speech and language therapy services, like audio services, like the provision of deaf aids or hearing aids, are about the basic human right to communicate. To do so is really a matter of mental health. It's a depression avoider, and it's a way to participate in civic society. The stammer prison, I would say, is as disabling in its way as the death sentence. Putting aside ethical questions, is there a broader monetary dividend to be had from liberating kids and adults alike from the confines of the speech disfluency, in that life chances get increased, as are their abilities to repay the costs and to contribute to speech therapy services in the future via taxation. Relatively, it costs peanuts, but I would argue that speech and language therapy now creates taxpayers later. The second political issue I want to touch on is just the relationship between politics and culture and group narrative, our group narrative, as people with stammers. Politics can be both the wind and the weather vane of change. It doesn't just respond, sometimes it can actually alter the direction of the wind. Perhaps a more recent example, as from around now, gay and lesbian people in the UK can marry one another legally, because of changes in our political weather system. Bathrooms for people with disabilities are now all over Schiphol Airport, perhaps not enough, but they're there because of politics. Every major Japanese city and numerous minor ones have these strips of indented tiles that along the pavement, so that people who are visually impaired can trace their way with a stick. They seem to have grooves, and I think I've seen a few starting around the Netherlands now, so I think you know what I'm talking about. This is all because of politics, which perhaps gives the question to us. It leads us to the question, how can people who stammer, how should we come together and mobilise and campaign for measures which enable us to coexist with our speech disfluences? What should these measures be? I don't have time to dwell on this question now, but surely access to speech and language therapy services should be high on the list. As should be, incidentally, I think, a campaign. This is a problem we've had in the UK and Ireland. It's sort of an elder generation of family doctor who, I think for far too long, encouraged concerned parents of kids with stammers to do nothing in the faith that it'll eventually sort itself out, they'll be grand in the long run. This can go on far too long, and there are probably no figures on how many kids don't get help, that even after 12, 18 months, 2 years, they're still being told by the doctors to do nothing. And probably the last thing I just want to touch on politics is again, the problem we have in the UK and Ireland. It's a constant buck passing between health authorities and education authorities. They both say that speech disfluences are the responsibilities of the other, especially in times when budgets get cut and people with speech disfluences and the families just kind of fall down in between this artificially created gap between health and education. That wasn't the last thing. The last thing is the naming and shaming of public figures who mock stammerers. This should be, laughing at people with stammers should be as much a no-go zone as blind people or the use of racist terminology. We should all be able to take it for granted that our speech disfluences would never be laughed at. But unfortunately, at least in the British tabloids, this isn't really the case. The opposition Chancellor of the Exchequer is in the UK, who's like our opposition finance minister, and if the Labour Party win the next general election, as it probably will, he will be the second most powerful person in the UK, is a gentleman called Ed Balls, and he has a speech disfluency. And fairly recently, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, during an exchange in the British Parliament on live TV, made a mocking remark about the quality of Ed Balls's response to a political statement in a debate that was happening. Stunning that in 2013 this can still happen. What was encouraging was the next day he had to make an explicit remark or a kind of half apology, the way certain politicians often do. He wasn't really referring to Ed Balls' speech impediment, he was sort of referring to the quality of the answer, but I respectfully say that he was lying. Politically, we need to illuminate public ignorance. But the good news is that a lot of people do want their ignorance dispelled, and I think they do want to listen, and they do want to learn, as I think the very, very warm response that the film The King's Speech had. The first time, the thing I loved about that film was, for the first time I know of, ever, non-stammerers could see their faces. They could see that kind of look of gormless amazement on their own faces that happens when a person with a stammer blocks. That probably did more good for our cause, politically and culturally, than any number of campaigns that our fledgling political wings could fund. I think I'm up to 8. A stammer is a course in practical linguistics. When I'm on the road promoting a book, I've made a new friend this morning, Casper from Amsterdam, and we're having quite a long conversation about this, but when I'm on the road promoting a book that I've written, I often identify a few passages that work well when read aloud. And so I read these passages, or these sections of my novels at book drops and festivals and so forth, and inevitably there will be 1 or 2 stammer words in the passage. I know they're there, I know they're waiting for me, and some nights, some evenings I can say them effortlessly, but I also find that I keep synonyms, substitutes, equivalents for these sticky, awkward words or phrases up my sleeve, so that if I am tired or if my stammer is especially bolshy, then I can substitute that alternative word. My conversation with Casper was about the rights and wrongs of doing that, and is that sort of an acceptable compromise or not? And it's a very good question. And a few emails to ungrateful British writers who live in Ireland who have forgotten to register. Thank you very much. Whose meaning or force can be adjusted by inflection, and that a single stress on one syllable can alter the centre of gravity of an entire phrase. People with stammers, people who auto-cue, me. We also learn about lexical register, and that some words and phrases sound more educated and adult and Latin-based, whereas other words and phrases are more street or more teen or maybe more Anglo-Saxon. Of course, all native speakers of a language learn this intuitively too, but of course for an auto-cueing, stammering kid, it can be a means of survival when you're in the schoolyard, and we really learn it. So if you're 12 and you can't say the M in the phrase, it's a matter of opinion, and you can't simply substitute it with the word subjective, because then you end up getting beaten up for talking posh. At least at my school you did. You need another phrase, and you need it now, instantly, because the point about self-auto-cueing is you have to do it without the other person suspecting, right? And sometimes there is no easy substitute, so you have to disassemble the sentences either side of the tricky phrase, and use conjunctions, but, and, so, however, to redirect the sentence back to your own meaning. And without false modesty, I became an extremely adept self-auto-cuer. It also, of course, helped the guilty secret of my stammer stay secret until I outed myself as a public stammerer many years later. And we can debate the rights and wrongs of that, and it's nothing I'm especially proud of, but it is something I did for survival, I guess. But what I want to say is that nowadays, as a professional writer, I use this practical knowledge of the mechanics and the electronics of speech every single day, and I consider it a blessing and not a curse that I have this knowledge. And that's all because of my stammer. And so sometimes the difference between a curse and a blessing is about 20 years. 9. A stammer is an empathy generator. Who would I be if I'd never stammered at all? If that day, 36 years ago or so, blimey, I feel old sometimes. If that day, 36 years ago, I'd said Napoleon, just fine. And I'd said everything else since, just fine. Like all that lot out there, the normals. Those who don't need to negotiate with their speech disorders, who can speak their mind and use language as naturally as the rest of us use oxygen. For years, while I believed that all you need is willpower, I'd decide, right, today's the day. Today's the magic day. That from today, I'll stammer no more and be like everyone else. It's just a matter of willpower. I just need to want it enough. But you know, now, even if I could, I'm no longer sure that I'd wish it away quite so quickly. If it meant that by doing so, I would also lose everything that my stammer has taught me and brought to me, and the ways in which it's influenced how I think and feel and how I be and who I am. Not just the knowledge about speech disfluences per se themselves, not just about practical linguistics, the mechanics and electronics of language, but about how life is lived and can be lived outside the kingdom of the able, the land of hunky-dory, or the state of well-being, where your mind and your body function as they're supposed to. I know that a reasonably mild speech disfluency is a very mild affliction indeed, but I like being a bit of an expert at living with a stammer. If I'm honest, I'm somewhat proud of my knowledge of this tiny, tiny area of the human condition, and I wouldn't want to lose it. It makes me immediately more compassionate to other people who have stammers, of course, but I think it also gives us a camaraderie, and a word that Theo used this morning, solidarity. It gives us a solidarity with a more broad community of people who live with some kind of mental or physical challenge. If life is a journey from ignorance to some kind of enlightenment, then actually a hardwired, built-in disability is a kind of a head start. I'm not romanticising it, I'm not recommending it, and I'm not agreeing with the Pope who recently told the parents of the kid racked with cerebral palsy that God had sent them their son this way to teach them how to love, which is a sentiment that makes me wince, if I'm honest, because he's not doing the 24-hour caring. And I'm not saying that enlightenment is the purpose of disability, but I am saying that a degree of eventual enlightenment is often a side effect of a disability, if only because enlightenment sometimes is the only way you get through to Friday, and then when you get to Friday, enlightenment is the only way you get through to Monday, and so on and on and on. It seems I often think that real wisdom and real truth, it's not actually in our sacred texts, it's in these slightly annoying day-to-day calendars that get put through the letterbox free around New Year's, just before the New Year, or it's on these little fridge magnets you can buy. It's just things like sort of, don't worry about tomorrow, just think about today. And things we know but we constantly forget. But a speech disfluency, any kind of disability, I think they can force you to remember because they help you cope. So, I'm also saying that pure and tactful empathy enriches the empathizer's mind more even than it enriches the life of the empathized with. Giving is the gift that keeps on giving. Up to 10, I think. Stammer is a challenge. It's a big, fat, juicy challenge. Stammer discourages you from speaking because doing so can be so damn humiliating. Yet here we are in a world of words, members of a species of ape that has risen to the top of the food chain and has the capacity to re-engineer nature herself, all through the power of language. Individually, we're pathetic and we wouldn't last 72 hours in the world, but collectively, we're amazing and the world has never seen anything like us and probably regrets us. But this collectivity is achieved through language. We are homo linguistica. So what do? Us lot who don't always have access to the fluency that the rest of the population can. Well, we find ways to cope. That's what we do. We evolve our own bag of tricks. I'll give my names. Sledgehammer, where I force a word out through a jam. It's quite high risk if it hammers back, but it generally does the job, sort of. My self-autocue, word avoidance, I've already discussed. I've got a fake hesitation, where I pretend to consider my very next word very carefully, and people think I'm a very thoughtful man indeed. Whereas what I'm really doing is just waiting for my stammer to drop its guard, so I can sneak the word through without it blocking me. And it often works, calms me down anyway. Neatest of all is my Swiss Army knife method, where I cut words in half and attach the first half to the word before, and the second half to the word comes after. The abracadabra, I made a stammer word disappear. An example would be, I always have trouble with the word salad. God only knows why it's that, but I have no trouble saying the word thus, and no problem with the made-up word alad. So instead of struggling with the order, can I have the salad, please? I can breeze through with a, can I have the salad, please? A challenge forces you to be inventive, this is what I want to say, and it forces you to be braver than you otherwise would be. I've seen lots of brave people speaking today already, braver than me. Yes, sometimes you'll fail, and sometimes, yes, you'll stammer at a mortifying moment. And yes, sometimes you'll see that look of gormless astonishment on the other person's face, or that pity. But at other times we win, and it works, and we get our point across. And these little successes keep me going. It feels great. Richard? Oh, I do. Okay. 11. The stammer is not an enemy. I have come to believe it's a part of yourself. I do use the word overcome in the context of stammer, but I kind of don't like myself for using it. Conquering your stammer, I actively dislike and avoid. As much as I dislike the notion about stammerers lacking willpower, the military metaphor turns ongoing stammerers into losers and serial defeatists, and we have enough to handle already. I believe our stammers are encoded in our genes, and by some process that I can't or don't understand, a switch is thrown sometime in childhood, and hey, we stammer. I don't necessarily believe in a cure, because I don't believe stammering is a disease. It can be bloody inconvenient, but yes, but that doesn't mean we're sick. I believe there's a helpful analogy perhaps with alcoholism, which I also believe is a genetic propensity. And a friend with personal experience of this says that he's a recovered alcoholic, and he says he will always be an alcoholic, and perhaps even was before his drink problem emerged. What he aims at now is becoming an alcoholic who never has a drink, and he's been like that for 5 or 6 years. Things got better for me when I stopped being in a state of ongoing civil war with my stammer and sought instead to become a non-stammering stammerer. I'll always have a stammer, I think. It'll always be there. But I'm much more okay with that than I ever used to be. And good things have happened. This isn't just a word nerd's exercise in semantics, becoming a non-stammering stammerer. Though I am a word nerd, and I'm proud of that too. When I viewed my stammer as a sick part of me that had to be exterminated, it fought back. But when I began viewing my stammer as a part of me, like my nose or my thumbprint or my left kidney, it began to respect me back. And these days, I feel I've come to a working accommodation with my stammer. I let it exist, and it lets me do live TV without blocking my words too much or too often. And if I do stammer, and someone has a problem with that, then I'm much better at thinking that it's their problem, not mine. I'm not saying, as I hope I made clear, that speech therapy is not necessary or helpful. I think it can be very, very helpful indeed, once the right approach has been identified for a given stammerer. But, yeah, I do think that rather than hoping or expecting therapy to eradicate the problem like a pest controller, I think that way of thinking is actually counterproductive, and perhaps the aim of speech therapy should be about curtailing inconvenience. Mind's a mysterious place. Mind. 12. Almost there. A stammer is a bridge. It's an odd thing to say about a speech defect, perhaps, which would seem to destroy bridges between people, not build them. But the fact is that if humanity had evolved without speech defects, none of us would be sitting here meeting each other today. And I, for one, am delighted to be here. Stammerers are everywhere. People who stammer are everywhere. Wherever human beings make communities, we're in all language groups, we're in all centuries, we're in all cultures. We struggle sometimes and we get by. We live our lives and we enjoy the good stuff and put up with the bad stuff. So let's be proud of ourselves. Let's use the knowledge that our stammers give us to help other people who stammer. Let's use what influence we have to break taboos, to eject old stereotypes, and, to quote Sam Goldwyn-Mayer, come up with some brand new cliches about us, but positive ones and not negative ones. Let's base these brand new cliches on our courage and on our fortitude and on our resilience. Let's be ambassadors and let's be role models. And let's get the message to kids who stammer that it's okay, that your speech disfluency will not have a stranglehold on your life. Stammering may not be cool, but so what? Neither is wearing socks and sandals or doing this at a Justin Bieber concert. Refusing to be defined or humiliated by your stammer, however. Now that's very cool indeed. That's about it. The sharp-eared amongst you will have noticed that I've only got 12 ways of looking at a stammer. But I've left the last one blank, rather cheekily, and I hope to crowdsource my 13th way of looking at a stammer. So if you see me in a bar or the elevator, please feel free to tell me what my 13th way of looking at a stammer could be. Thank you for listening. I look forward to hearing your ideas. I must say thank you, which I didn't say at the beginning, thank you to Demosthenes and to all the volunteers and to our team here at Richard, because these things don't happen by magic, do they? They happen by hard work and a million emails and a few emails to ungrateful British writers who live in Ireland who have forgotten to register. Thank you very much.